So let's just start with a really tough question. Is a perfectly equal society worth any price? It's a question that gets to the very heart of one of the most powerful and, most destructive ideas in all of human history. To really get our heads around this whole thing, we've got to go back, way back, to the beginning. And you know what? We can actually start with a simple idea, something you've probably seen yourself, right in your own school days. Think about it. There are basically two kinds of teachers. So, on the one hand, you've got the teacher who's all about the star students, right? They pour in all their energy into the high achievers, the ones who are going to go on to do amazing things, and in theory, pull the rest of society forward. The other kids, well, they just have to try and keep up. And that's a lot like the capitalist ideal. But then you've got the other teacher. Their focus is completely different. They're looking out for the students who are struggling, making sure nobody gets left behind. The idea is that the whole class rises together through cooperation, not competition. And that vision, that's the very soul of the socialist promise. And the second vision, this idea of a world built on total equality and cooperation, well, that was championed by this guy, Karl Marx. He was a German philosopher, a really fiery journalist, living right in the middle of this massive, chaotic upheaval we call the 19th century Industrial Revolution. He started out writing about some pretty deep ideas, like human alienation, but he'd end up becoming famous for a brand new and pretty radical theory of history. And you have to understand the world he was looking at. I mean, it was just brutal. He saw factories and coal mines just swallowing up men, women, and even kids as young as 7 for grueling, endless work. He saw cities choked with pollution, a society that felt colder and colder, and a brand new system where it seemed everything and everyone had a price tag. For Marx, this system, capitalism, it wasn't just a little flawed, it was rotten to the core, and he was absolutely convinced he knew why. So Marx believed he'd basically cracked the code of history itself. He called his theory historical materialism. The core idea is this: it's not great ideas or great leaders that drive history. It's economics. The way a society produces stuff, its factories, its farms, its technology. He called this the economic base. That's what determines everything else. Your politics, your laws, your culture. All of that is just the superstructure built on top. And the entire story of history is just one long, brutal fight between different classes for control of that economic base. And here's what's so wild about Marx's theory. You can see it right here. He saw history as a straight line, totally predictable. It wasn't random at all. He believed it unfolded in these clear stages. You start with primitive communism, hunter-gatherers sharing everything. Then someone invents private property, and boom, you get the slave system. That evolves into feudalism with its lords and serfs, and then you get to his era, capitalism, which he saw as this big fight between the factory owners, the bourgeoisie, and the workers, the proletariat. But here's the key: this wasn't the end of the line. For Marx, this was all leading to one final inevitable destination, a massive workers' revolution that would smash the whole system and bring about pure communism, a classless, stateless utopia where everything, property, power, was shared by everyone. So it all comes down to this one thing: private property. I mean, for Adam Smith, the father of capitalism, private property was the engine of everything. It's what motivated people to innovate and create wealth. But for Marx, it was the root of all evil. It was the original sin of humanity. The second one person stood up and said, "This is mine," you created the haves and the have-nots, the master and the slave, the owner and the worker. For Marx, pretty much all of human suffering flowed from that one single concept. And Marx argued that capitalism actually had this fatal flaw, that it contained the seeds of its own destruction. Think about it for a second. To make the most profit, a factory owner has to pay their workers as little as possible, right? But wait a minute. If you make the entire working class poor, who's going to buy all the stuff your factories are making? It's a huge contradiction. Marx was sure this would lead to these crazy economic crises, each one worse than the last, until finally the workers, with absolutely nothing left to lose, would just rise up. And this all leads to his most famous and most explosive call to action. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Workers of the world, unite. But then, history threw a massive curveball. The Great Workers' Revolution. It didn't happen in the big industrial powerhouses like Britain or Germany, where Marx swore it would. Nope. The first time this theory was ever put into practice was in the one place it probably shouldn't have been: the huge, mostly agricultural and still basically feudal Russian Empire. Okay, so picture this. It's 1917. Russia is just getting crushed by World War I. The country is literally on its knees. You've got food riots in the cities, soldiers are just walking away from the front lines. It's total chaos. And into this power vacuum steps one man, Vladimir Lenin. His big idea was to tweak Marxist theory. He argued that you don't have to wait around for capitalism to run its course. A small, super disciplined group of professional revolutionaries, what he called a vanguard party, could just seize power and basically hit the fast-forward button on history. And that is exactly what they did. The Bolsheviks' plan was fast, and it was total. 1. Seize all private land. Done. 2. Nationalize every bank and every factory. Done. 3. They set up what they called a dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, in theory, that meant the working class themselves were in charge. But in reality, it meant absolute unquestioned power for the Communist Party, who just said they were ruling for the people. The great experiment had officially begun. So after Lenin died, power fell to a man whose nickname really tells you everything you need to know: Joseph Stalin, the man of steel. His vision for communism was all about brute force and total state control, a path that, frankly, horrified a lot of other Marxists around the world. He was going to drag the peasant nation of Russia into the industrial age, and he would let absolutely nothing and no one stand in his way. And you have to give him this. On paper, his brutal 5-year plans were a mind-blowing success. I mean, just look at these numbers. Between 1928 and 1940, Soviet production of steel, coal, electricity, it just went through the roof. The Soviet Union went from a backwater to an industrial superpower in just over a decade. The pace was so fast, it absolutely shocked the capitalist West. But, and this is a huge but, this transformation came at a price that is almost impossible to comprehend. See, to get the fuel for all these new factories, Stalin forced millions of peasants off their land and onto these massive, state-run collective farms. And when they resisted, as you can imagine they did, the state just seized all their grain. The result was a completely man-made famine, especially in Ukraine, on a scale that is just apocalyptic. It's known as the Holodomor, which means death by hunger. Somewhere between 3 and 7 million people starved to death while the government was exporting the very grain that could have saved their lives. The entire economy was run like a military campaign. If you disagreed with a plan, you weren't just a critic. You were labeled an enemy of the people. Millions were arrested, packed onto trains, and sent to the infamous Gulag, this huge network of forced labor camps, mostly out in the frozen hellscape of Siberia. A huge chunk of the Soviet industrial miracle that we saw in the last slide, it was built by slaves. And for just an ordinary person trying to live their life, well, life was a constant struggle, defined by one single thing: the line, the queue. Since the state controlled literally every factory, shortages were just a part of daily life. There were lines for bread, lines for soap, lines for shoes. You know, there was this dark joke that went around at the time. A guy gets totally fed up after standing in a meat queue for hours. He yells, "That's it! I'm going to the Kremlin to kill Stalin," and storms off. He comes back a couple hours later, and his friends ask, "Well, did you do it?" And he just sighs and says, "No, the line over there was even longer." So after the dust settled from World War II, where the Soviets and the West had been allies against the Nazis, that alliance just shattered. The world split right down the middle into two hostile camps: the capitalist West, led by the US, and the communist East, led by the USSR. A famous Iron Curtain had descended right across the continent of Europe. And this picture captures the human drama of that division better than almost anything I've ever seen. The date is August 1961. They've only just started building the Berlin Wall a few days before. That soldier is a 19-year-old East German border guard named Konrad Schumann. On the other side, in West Berlin, you've got people yelling at him, "Come on, come over." You can just imagine the moment. He hesitates, and then he drops his rifle, and he just goes for it. He leaps over that barbed wire into freedom, and a photographer just happened to be there to capture that exact incredible second. His jump became this huge symbol of the Cold War. They even made a statue of it that you can see in Berlin today. But the thing is, Schumann's own story it's just so tragic. He was cut off from his family, his home, everything he'd ever known back in the East. He suffered from terrible depression, and many years later, he ended up taking his own life. His story is just this heartbreaking reminder that these huge ideological battles, they were lived and often lost by real ordinary people. For decades, it really seems like the Soviet system was permanent, like it was just a fact of life, immovable. But by the 1980s, you could start to see the cracks. The economy was completely stagnating, and the people were getting more and more restless. That old promise of a worker's paradise, it had turned into this grim reality of repression and just waiting in line. Sometimes the thing that changes history isn't some grand speech or a big battle. Sometimes it's just a trip to the grocery store. In 1989, a high-ranking Soviet official, a guy named Boris Yeltsin, was on a visit to the US, and he stopped by a Randall's supermarket near Houston, Texas, and he was just floored, completely speechless. He saw these endless aisles of fresh fruit and vegetables, thousands of different products, no lines, no shortages. He wrote about it later, saying that single experience completely shattered his faith in communism. He realized right then and there that if his own people, who stood in line for hours just to get the basics, ever saw this kind of abundance, the whole system would collapse overnight. And you know what? He was absolutely right. The collapse, when it finally happened, was just unbelievably fast. Later that same year, 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. In 1990, that same Boris Yeltsin was elected president of Russia, still inside the USSR. And then, by the end of 1991, the Soviet Union, that massive empire built on Marx's dream, just ceased to exist. The 74-year experiment was over. Which brings us all the way back to the beginning and leaves us with a really, really difficult question. The communist promise, the idea, was one of perfect equality, right? A world with no exploitation, no poverty. But trying to build that world in the 20th century led to totalitarianism, to gulags, to mass starvation. So, when a beautiful idea is paved with terror and famine, does the idea itself survive its execution? Can you, or even should you, separate the dream from the absolute nightmare it became?